If you tell a big enough lie and repeat it often enough, people will come to believe it. Although this cynical maxim might have come from the fertile brain of Joseph Goebbels, the seed had been planted by his master, Adolf Hitler. The Führer lied to the Nazi Party, he lied to the German people, he lied to his generals, and he lied to the world. As a result of some of the most effective use of propaganda ever seen, his lies were believed by most of the people most of the time. Adolf Hitler's seizure of power was achieved through skilled manipulation of the German people. This power he maintained through the threat of terror. His eminence grise was Dr. Joseph Goebbels, a master at exploiting humanity's worst prejudices. Propaganda, the use of publicity and information services to spread instructions, doctrine, or practices, has often been seen as the tool of the 20th century dictatorships in Russia and Germany. As such, the word has now taken on unacceptable overtones. In the last century, two types of propaganda were defined. White, concerned with truth and enlightenment, and black, which uses lies to confuse and deceive. The Nazis used both. Before the war, Nazi propaganda was aimed first at achieving power, second at nation building, and third at defining racial identity. In their drive for political power, the Nazis unashamedly twisted history. They attacked the Weimar Republic for their acceptance of the Kriegsschuldlüge, the war guilt lie, otherwise known as Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles. This placed the responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the Great War solely onto Germany. The Nazis blamed the government for stabbing the frontline soldier in the back, though in truth, the German armies had been defeated in the field, and it would only have been a matter of time before Germany was occupied. Communists, Social Democrats, and Jews were also targets for hostile propaganda, reflecting in part the personal hatreds of the Nazi leader. The driving force behind Nazi propaganda was the physically unattractive, small, dark, and slightly disabled Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels. The club-footed Goebbels had studied American journalism and advertising techniques before being drawn to the fledgling Nazi Party. Goebbels' big opportunity came when, aged 27, he was hired by Hitler's rival Gregor Strasser to edit National Socialist letters. This fortnightly newsletter was intended to keep Nazi officials in tune with the party line. Goebbels saw the Catholic Church as a model for spreading the Nazi ideology. He was particularly impressed that every Catholic priest in the whole world reads the same prayers on the same day, even at the same hour, in the same Latin language, from the same breviary. When he looked deeply into the Church's festivals, its processions, and its liturgy, he at once saw their value as a means of building up habits of unquestioning obedience. In secularized form, he believed they must be adopted by the party and state. For Goebbels, the end justified the means. Any propaganda was good propaganda if it was effective, even if to unbiased observers it was questionable or even mendacious. Long before the TV soundbite had been invented, he had mastered the short, powerful slogan. These phrases could be shouted, painted on walls and shop fronts, or printed on posters or leaflets. These included the execrable "Die Juden sind unser Unglück," the Jews are our misfortune, Judas Jude, Judas Jew, and also Blut und Boden, blood and soil, Volk ohne Raum, people without space, Heiliger Grund und Boden, holy ground and soil. Goebbels possessed a mellow, resonant voice, which he used to maximum effect in broadcasts and at rallies. The biggest propaganda tool available to Goebbels was the Führer himself. There is no question that Adolf Hitler's oratory was an almost elemental force. He had a demonic gift for invoking in vast crowds a state of mindless devotion. An observer noted, he begins slowly, speaking in a low, slow tenor voice. But after about 15 minutes, something occurs that can only be described by the ancient primitive metaphor. The spirit enters into him. Hitler confessed on one occasion that in front of a spellbound, adoring crowd, he became transfigured. However, after 5 years in power, even Hitler was beginning to believe the propaganda myths about his infallibility. In the summer of 1937, he declared, "When I look back upon the 5 years that lie behind us, I can say this was not the work of human hands alone." As with Joseph Stalin in Soviet Russia, the image of Adolf Hitler was ubiquitous in the Third Reich. His visage was drilled into the national psyche. Bronze busts and plaques of the Führer, his face set in a severe frown, were prominently positioned in many public places in Nazi Germany. These images took on the character of icons. Some households set up a shrine like Hitler Corner, and as Allied air raids increased, it was widely believed that if a house was hit, this corner would miraculously be spared destruction. On the 20th of April, the Führer's birthday, photographs and portraits of Germany's leader were printed in every newspaper. Committed Nazis threw Führer parties, and special events were held all over Germany. The crowning glory was if Hitler himself came, but his presence was usually reserved for the major birthday celebrations in Berlin. These varied from military parades through Germanic art festivals to concerts by the Berlin Philharmonic. Hitler himself was extremely image conscious, doing his utmost to ensure that only officially sanctioned photographs were disseminated to the public. He was usually depicted as the stern or paternal leader in whose hands Germany was secure. The exception was when he was photographed with children. These were the few times when the Führer would allow his public to see him smile. The image added to his myth. From the beginning, the German people were told that Hitler and Hitler alone had solved the economic woes of the country, restored its military self-respect, and recovered the territory lost following the armistice of 1918. When the Nazis came to power, they instituted Gleichschaltung, or coordination of the political will, which was first mooted by Hitler in March 1933. By the end of the year, new state and social institutions under Nazi control had been introduced. Joseph Goebbels, who was head of the party propaganda office, was now made Minister for Propaganda and Enlightenment. From this position, he could direct the whole apparatus of information and entertainment to further Nazi aims and ideals. The state used film, radio, books, newspapers and magazines, as well as the powerful public spectacle of festivals, holidays and mass rallies. In an attempt to weaken the traditional religious festivals, the Nazis introduced 11 new public holidays that were set aside for parades and celebrations. While some were political anniversaries, others, mainly inspired by Himmler, were pagan Nordic celebrations that paralleled the Christian holidays. The Nazis actually parodied the Easter celebration of death and resurrection in two of their festivals, the National Day of Mourning and the anniversary of the Munich Putsch. Before 1933, the National Day of Mourning had been a time of quiet remembrance when war cemeteries were visited and tidied up. Under the Nazis, it was renamed Heroes' Remembrance Day and finally became the Day of Restoration of Military Sovereignty with the motto, "They have not died in vain." On On the anniversary of the Munich Putsch, the venerated survivors of this ill-conceived failed coup silently reenacted their march through the crowd-lined streets of the Bavarian capital. Described as a bombastic travesty of a passion play, burning beacons like giant funeral pyres marked the route. At the Feldherrenhalle, the names of the slain were solemnly declaimed. However, in this parody of the Stations of the Cross, the Saviour had survived. He retraced the route in uniform and jackboots at the head of his disciples. Calvary and the resurrection had blended into one soul-stirring event. Far and away the most important propaganda events in pre-war Germany were the Reich Party days, the Nuremberg rallies. The Nuremberg rallies were not true political meetings. They were propaganda exercises designed to glorify the Führer and National Socialism, both to the ordinary Nazi in the street and to the rest of the world. The Parteitage, or Party Days, had started in a small way, with 2 parades in January and August 1923. The third took place in July 1926, the first in Nuremberg. By 1933, when Hitler's coming to power was celebrated, the Party Days were massive theatrical events. One of the enduring images of the Nuremberg rallies is of massed ranks of stormtroopers, SS men and Nazi party officials, framed by hundreds of red, white and black swastika banners, the whole assembly echoing to the roar of thousands of voices shouting Sieg Heil. The other abiding image is of Adolf Hitler's sweating face listening in the stage lighting, holding his listeners spellbound as he rants against Jews, Marxists, Bolsheviks, pacifists, the Treaty of Versailles, the Weimar Republic, France and Soviet Russia. This image was created in large part by Leni Riefenstahl's groundbreaking film Triumph des Willens, The Triumph of the Will, made in 1934. The 1934 rally at Nuremberg lasted from the 3rd to the 10th of September. Riefenstahl, a former actress turned director, employed 30 cameramen to record the event. Given a free hand by the Führer himself, she had special trackways and elevators built to produce dramatic shots of the rally. The film which emerged is probably the most powerful piece of propaganda ever created. It turned Hitler into a Wagnerian hero, from his arrival godlike through the enveloping clouds to the last images of his face lit by the flickering light of the torches of the faithful. Riefenstahl's memorable images included massive processions by day and night, the unfurling of 21,000 flags, the adoration of the masses of German youth, and the impassioned oratory of the Führer himself. In one 10-minute section, Riefenstahl turned her director's gaze upon the 50,000 men of the Reichsarbeitsdienst. These builders of the Third Reich, the sun reflecting from their shouldered spades, chant a new litany, not to the Christian God, but to the glory of the Führer. We stand here, we are ready. A roll call shows that these men represent all of the main Gau or districts of National Socialist Germany. The refrain resumes, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. We plant trees, we build streets, we give the farmers new acres for Germany. In the film, slow music follows the roll call. Flags are ceremonially lowered as the RAD perform drill. Hitler watches with grimly benevolent concentration and then addresses the men. Earth and labor unite us all. The entire nation goes through your school. Germany is happy to see her sons marching. Triumph of the Will received a National State Prize, the Gold Medal of the Venice Film Festival, and a Grand Prix of the French government at the Paris Film Festival. Hitler took the opportunity of the 1935 rally to present the Nuremberg laws on race and citizenship. Directed primarily at the Jews, they made clear to the rest of the world the true character of the new German government. For the first time, the military played a major part in the proceedings. Hitler had cast aside the shackles of Versailles earlier that year, announcing German rearmament. Now that they were in the open, the armed forces could parade the tanks, artillery, armored cars and aircraft, which they had been secretly developing for years. In 1936, in a rally with the theme of honor and freedom, there were further displays of German might. A year later, Hitler, in full flow, pronounced to the disciples that the Third Reich would last for 1,000 years. The greatest and last Nuremberg rally was held from the 5th to the 12th of September 1938. Each day was dedicated to a separate theme: welcome, Congress of Labour, fellowship, politics, youth, stormtroopers, and finally the armed forces. The rally incorporated all the accumulated experience of past years with parades, banners, reviews, speeches, torchlight processions, and fireworks. Over 1 million people attended, and hundreds of reporters from throughout the world covered the event. The 1939 rally was to be the party day of freedom. Plans for what would have been the biggest rally yet had to be abandoned. Many of the military personnel who would have been involved were otherwise engaged in conquering Poland. The rallies might have seemed like a spontaneous outpouring of devotion to the Führer, but they were orchestrated down to the last Sieg Heil. Perhaps one of the most cynical examples of what might now be called spin doctoring at rallies was Jubel Dritter Stufe, or Jubilation Third Stage. To anyone watching the German newsreels of the time, the audience reaction appears to be spontaneous as the people jump to their feet, arms raised, bellowing Sieg Heil. But every second was stage managed. Under the Jubilation Third Stage, a decibel value was assigned for the volume, and colored lights gave the audience the cue to deliver the required level of enthusiasm. A key feature of all party rallies was the appearance of the Blutfahne, or blood banner. This was the Holy of Holies, the most revered symbol in the Third Reich. The Blutfahne was one of the flags used during the abortive Munich Putsch in 1923. Carried by Heinrich Trumbauer as the Nazis clashed with state police at Odeon Square, it was spattered with the blood of Andreas Bauriedl, who was one of 16 men killed during the rising. This relic was placed in the keeping of the SS in 1926, and Jakob Grimminger was appointed standard bearer. Grimminger was a veteran of both World War I and of street fights with the communists, and would remain bearer until the blood banner disappeared at the end of the war. The Blutfahne was displayed at all major Nazi ceremonials, the most prominent of which was the consecration of the Feldzeichen, or banners of newly formed SA and SS units. These almost invariably took place during the annual Nuremberg party rallies. Holding the blood banner in one hand and the new standard in the other, Hitler acted as the medium by which the magic of one sacred symbol was transmitted to the other. By holding the two flags in contact for a few seconds, the Blutfahne made a mystic connection between the new Nazi units and the fighters and martyrs of the early days of the movement. This ritual would remain one of the most important of all the Nuremberg ceremonies. Riefenstahl followed Triumph of the Will with a film of the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games. This internationally acclaimed depiction of the 11th Olympiad celebrated a nation which had grown from economic ruin to become the stable, confident community seen on screen. The 1936 Berlin Olympic Games were held only 3.5 years after Hitler came to power. After initial reservations, by holding the Games, Germany would have to play host to Jews and blacks competing for other countries. The Nazis decided that the propaganda opportunities were simply too great to be missed. In 1933, the Führer told the International Olympic Committee that Germany would not bar any competitor for racial reasons. The government built 9 arenas for the Games, including a magnificent main stadium. During the course of the Games, anti-Jewish propaganda was kept hidden. On the opening day, a crowd of 110,000 roared with delight when the shot putter Hans Roker won gold for Germany. However, wins by competitors from other countries caused the disenchanted Hitler to leave the stadium. He was particularly offended when the black American Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals for track and field events. But in spite of such unpalatable results, the Games were considered a great success by the Nazis. Not only had Germany won the largest number of medals, but more importantly, they had presented Germany as a nation on the move. Although Germany lacked a true national press before the Nazi assumption of power, it had one of the most extensive networks of local publications in the world, 4,700 newspapers in 1933. The press gradually came under control of the Nazis until by 1943, nearly 80% of the 977 remaining papers were controlled by Max Amann. Amann had been Hitler's sergeant major in the trenches and had advised him on business in the 1920s. He was now a Reichsleiter and head of the NSDAP publications office. From the start, the National Socialists recognized the importance of the printed word. The first Nazi newspaper became the Volkischer Beobachter, the official party daily. Each of the party organizations produced its own journals. These included S.R. Mann, the Stormtrooper Weekly, and the Schwarzer Korps of the SS. More popular were the illustrated news magazines, such as the Illustrierte Beobachter. At the bottom of the heap were the scurrilous, racist, and pornographic outpourings of Julius Streicher's Der Stürmer. The scatological and obscene anti-Semitic tabloid was aimed at the most ignorant and prejudiced elements of the German population, though Hitler is said to have read it avidly from cover to cover. By the end of the 1930s, it was selling over 500,000 copies per issue. Radio was vital to the Nazi propaganda machine. Hitler himself was to say that without motor cars, movies, and the radio, there would have been no victory of National Socialism. If a government can influence what a person sees as they're out on the streets or at work, or spending an evening at the cinema, then you have them for a day, an evening, or a week. But if you can put your message in the front room of your audience day and night, then you can take their soul. In his first year in power, Hitler made more than 50 broadcasts. It was used both to entertain and instruct. A diet of light music interspersed with propaganda. As the war progressed, the music content grew until by 1943 it made up more than 70% of all broadcasts. The Nazi poster was a crucial element in creating the National Socialist spirit within Germany. It was part of the total visual effort of persuasion and intimidation at which the Nazis were so skilled. Every message in a poster was to be confined to the barest necessities, expressed in stereotypical formulas, so frequently repeated that their underlying idea was imprinted on the memory. Hitler wanted to appeal not to the educated, but to the broad masses. For such a campaign, posters were an ideal medium. If you put up enough of them, they would be impossible to ignore, like the ever-present face of Big Brother in George Orwell's 1984. The posters became models of their art, using advertising techniques far ahead of their time. They invariably carried a single message concept, reinforced by drawings and graphics that was simple, straightforward, and bold. Expressing themselves, as the Nazis always did, in terms of struggle and warfare, the messages screaming from the walls were uncompromising. Perish, Judah, and join our struggle were typical, but not as typical as Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer, one country, one people, one leader. The tone changed with the outbreak of war, but the messages were still simple. Victory will be ours, and fight on to victory. Goebbels longed to get his hands on the film industry. He saw it as an ideal medium for persuasion. He chafed when he saw it representing negative ideas before 1933, as in Erich Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. To disrupt its premiere, Goebbels had stormtroopers release white mice and snakes among the audience. The shrewd propaganda minister knew that an uninterrupted diet of propaganda would soon tire the public. Overtly Nazi propaganda films were not successful. SR Mann Brandt and Hitler Junge Quecks were flops. Goebbels was a quick learner. He used entertainment to fill the cinemas so that when he had an important message to convey, the audience was there. Furthermore, Goebbels was film-struck. He loved the milieu and was at his happiest with film people. Most of his many liaisons were with film stars. It took a direct order from Hitler to end his affair with actress Lida Barova. As with all other artistic media, the industry was brought under the control of the relevant Reich chamber. As is usual when artists are controlled by bureaucrats, the general standard of entertainment went down. Bucolic mountain tales and rural travelogues tried to portray an idealized version of Germany under the Nazis. But while some directors were happy to film farmers going about their business and pretty scenes of rural towns, the strict controls led inevitably to a flight of talent abroad. Marlene Dietrich, Peter Lorre and Fritz Lang were prominent emigrants. The majority, however, swallowed their pride and simply did what they were told to do. And what they were told to do was not always pleasant. Cinema had long been used by the Nazis to promote their anti-Semitic views in films like Jud Sus and Der ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew. But it was also a psychological tool. The Eternal Jew, which likened Jews to scavenging rats, was shown to men of the Einsatzgruppen who were about to embark on their campaign of mass slaughter in Russia. Heroic historical themes were also covered, the most extravagant being the film Kohlberg, that was started on the express instruction of Dr. Goebbels in 1943. It was intended to be a morale booster and was based on an incident in the Napoleonic Wars when a small Prussian town defended itself against the French army. The film cost 8.5 million Reichsmarks to make and used thousands of frontline soldiers withdrawn from the Eastern Front as extras. 6,000 horses were diverted from military use, tons of blank ammunition were fired, and over 100 railway trucks were pulled out of the hard-pressed German railway system. They were needed to transport salt to simulate snow. When war was declared, German propaganda had two aims. These were to sustain morale and to attack the enemy. To this end, radio, the press, theatre, cinema, posters and loudspeaker vans bombarded the German nation with the party line. For the Germans, the years from 1939 to the winter of 1941 were a propaganda bonanza. They were victorious on all fronts. Signal, the stylish German news magazine that modeled itself on Picture Post and Life magazine, was published in 20 languages. It celebrated German victories with lavish use of color photography. The name had been chosen because it was a word that was universal throughout Europe. After 1943, Signal presented a version of Nazi Germany that was increasingly at variance with the reality of a country suffering shortages and under constant air attack. The Germany shown in Signal was a land untroubled by war, where the harvest was gathered in, artists and craftsmen thrived, and the war was at a safe distance. At the beginning of the war, the men of the propaganda companies, or PKs, swung into action. Before the war, Goebbels' ministry had compiled a list of reporters, photographers and cameramen who would make good war correspondents. They attended an 8-week training course covering war reporting techniques and military skills. They were described by Goebbels as cold-blooded and fearless, and newsreel film footage shot by PK cameramen was evidence of their courage as it took German audiences into the front line. As the war progressed, the newsreel cameramen came into their own. As well as producing material for the weekly Wochenschau, they also filmed full-length war documentaries. Feuer Taufer, baptism of fire, recorded the 18-day Polish campaign and Sieg im Westen, victory in the West, about the Blitzkrieg of May and June 1940. From this time on, Goebbels seldom failed to comment on the weekly newsreel in his diaries, and with his notes on the subject attached short summaries of the reports on the morale of the people collected by the Gestapo and SD. The outbreak of war also obliged German artists to harness their skills to furthering the national good. Those who were seconded to the services were given officer rank and worked either for the German High Command or the propaganda companies. Their work was now Kunst der Front, frontline art. That work ranged from precise lithographs, which had an almost photographic detail, to near expressionist oils. War artists went to every front from the Arctic to the desert and accompanied naval units on missions into the North Sea and the Atlantic. Artists also had the task of immortalizing recipients of the Knight's Cross. These paintings were in turn made into postcards and sold through the Reich to raise morale. The attack on the USSR in 1941 marked the beginning of the Sondermeldungen, or radio broadcasts of victories. At Hitler's request, these special announcements were preceded by the rolling drums and fanfare from the opening to Liszt's preludes. For their broadcast propaganda operations against the enemy, the Germans found some unusual allies. To British listeners, particularly during the grim months after the fall of France in 1940, one voice represented the German enemy. William Joyce was an Anglo-American whose sneering upper-class tones earned him the name of Lord Haw-Haw. His work mocked the British war effort, but he was not taken seriously. Born in the USA, he had lived most of his life in Ireland and Britain and held a British passport. He joined the British Union of Fascists in 1933 and in 1939 moved to Germany. He was captured by British troops on the 28th of May 1945. Tried at the Old Bailey for treason, he was sentenced to death and hanged in London on the 3rd of January 1946. Once America had entered the war, another rather more entertaining voice could be heard. Mildred Gillars, known to US soldiers as Axis Sally, first went to Germany in the 1920s as a music student. Allied troops fighting in Italy enjoyed her taste in jazz and popular music, but found her propaganda rather amusing. She was arrested in 1945 and served 12 years in a federal prison. Propaganda became even more important when the war turned against Germany. Goebbels was a powerful orator, and after the disaster at Stalingrad, worked hard to rebuild national morale. He mobilized the press and radio to unite the nation in martial grief. The whole of German propaganda must create a myth out of the heroism of Stalingrad, he explained. That battle was to become one of the most treasured possessions in German history. On the 18th of February 1943, at the Berlin Sportpalast, Goebbels faced a mass rally with the theme Totaler Krieg, Kürzester Krieg, or Total War is the Shortest War. Like a Greek chorus, the audience responded to his demand, "Do you want total war?" "Yes," came the roared response. "Are you determined to follow the Führer and fight for victory whatever the cost?" "Yes," they bellowed back. Echoing the great call to the Prussians in 1812, his resonant voice boomed out over the loudspeakers. "Let our war cry be, now the people rise up and the storm break loose." Goebbels may have challenged the Germans to make new sacrifices, but he also promised them that new wonder weapons like the V1 and V2 would bring the war to a satisfactory conclusion. His propaganda portrayed the Western Allies as terror bombers, while the enemy in the East were a ravening horde of Bolsheviks intent on slaughter. As the Red Army and the Western Allies advanced into Germany in the spring of 1945, incredibly they found endless graffiti still proclaiming belief in ultimate victory. On the wall of a ruined building in the western fringes of Germany, huge whitewashed letters demanded of their readers, "Was hast du heute für Deutschland getan?" What have you done for Germany today? Even when it should have been clear to anybody that Germany was doomed, The mass of the population did not lose faith in Hitler. He would save them with new wonder weapons, and if defeat was inevitable, then there were rumors that the nation would be put gently to sleep with a painless gas. When the excesses of the final solution became public in 1945, many Germans firmly believed that this had been the work of renegade Nazis, since the Führer would never have permitted it. Earlier, radio broadcasts announcing Hitler's death in battle prompted a wave of suicides, and those who died never knew that they had been duped. Hitler, the Nazi god, had not gone out facing the Soviet hordes. He had committed suicide in the sordid depths of a Berlin bunker. Goebbels, the Nazis' propaganda master, remained passionately loyal to Hitler until the end. He moved his wife and family into the Führer bunker in Berlin in 1945. At the last, after Hitler's death, he poisoned his family and committed suicide with his wife.